Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of SPME and ESMIA, and it is my privilege once again to welcome you all to our webinar series. This is the first of the 2025, the beginning of the new year. And really, we have the privilege and honor to talk to our friend Ken Stein this afternoon. Who will talk about obviously Jimmy Carter. With Jimmy Carter's passing, there is nobody else who has the knowledge and the in-depth knowledge of the psychology and of the man than I think that Ken Stein does. Ken is a prolific, long-term contemporary Middle East historian. He's taught at Emory for the majority of his career. He's currently now the president of the Center for Israel Education in Atlanta, as well, since he retired from teaching at Emory full time. He, during his career, he has spent hundreds of hours in discussions about the Middle East with Jimmy Carter about these very issues. He also co-wrote The Blood of Abraham. After Stein also served at the Carter Center for years, and then resigned after Carter published his book Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, and had the moral courage to stand up for the fallacies within that book itself. That being said, Ken was intimately involved with a lot of the conversations that Carter had over the years within the Middle East. He recently wrote a prolific article in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs about Jimmy Carter's Middle East legacies, which we will send around after the webinar, which I highly recommend people read. But this afternoon, he'll do some of the highlights and give us really, I think, will be a very interesting and a very important conversation about who Carter was and about his legacies regarding the Middle East at large. Housekeeping wise, Ken will talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat, so please type in your questions via the chat, and we will do our best to get to all of them in a timely fashion. If we don't, please feel free to email us after the webinar, and then we will also respond after that. So really, without further ado, Ken, thank you again for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf. Thank ASME and SPME and your colleagues. A shout out to Lori Reagan, having been here many, many years ago. I think she actually sat in one of my classes. Where to begin? Well, as any historian, a word about my sources. I started out as a Middle East historian, having gotten a degree at Michigan, and used documents as primary drivers of the research that I undertook. These were archives which I took from all sorts of different places. So when I finished my dissertation on the land question in Palestine, I came to Emory and taught using documents. And documents and sources became sort of my prayer book. And consequently, in the process of teaching about the contemporary Middle East, documents became critical, and what was written was important, and what was omitted was important. What was the context or the perspective of a particular piece of evidence? So I'm sort of a devotee, if not an idol worshiper of sources. Having said that, I came to understand American foreign policy basically through the context of the evolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the diplomacy associated with it. When I started in Atlanta at Emory in January of 1977, first week of January, 2 or 3 weeks later, Jimmy Carter started his presidency, became the 39th president of the United States and the only president that was elected from Georgia. I did not meet him until 1981 at a reception at Emory University. So I had no engagement in the Camp David negotiations or SALT II or Iran, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. All that happened. I was an observer living in Atlanta, no knowledge of anything personal or intimate connected with it. So there were a lot of other people who worked for Carter, a lot of other people who worked with him running for office, for governor, and then for president. A very few of them are still alive. And there are only a couple of us who are still around who were part of the foundations of the Carter Presidential Center and the Carter Library, which started in 1981, 82, as he began to raise funds for the library and for the center. I'll get back to the outline or the framework of the center in a moment. But a word about what I've learned about Carter. So what I learned about Carter really comes about through reading biographies of him and reading interviews and reading articles that were written in the 70s, both before and after he became president. Wonderful articles written in first-rate journals by wonderful journalists who had different views of the Carter administration, of politics at the moment. And then added to that, I was fortunate that I was able to get my hands on some very interesting interviews done by individuals who served in the Carter administration, who served under Kissinger as well. These were people in the State Department, Roy Atherton, Hal Saunders, Sam Lewis, Herman Niles, just to name four. And those interviews were all found in the Association for Diplomatic Studies. They're all online for anyone to read. You can read Sam Lewis's 325-page exit interview on what it was like being ambassador to Israel from 1977 until 1985. It's an extraordinary excursion into how one man saw U.S.-Israeli relations. And Sam was at the Camp David negotiations as well. And then you go ahead and you find out that there were many other individuals who served as ambassadors, as State Department officials, individuals who were spaced around the Middle East, those who worked on the Arab-Israeli desk. And lo and behold, you put together 40, 50, or 60 of these interviews that are all published, and they're all available for anyone who wants to spend the time. And I recommend, if you really want to get drunk and learn interesting things, go pick 4 or 5 of the most important names. Once I met Carter in 81, I got exposed a little bit to his administration, and I learned a little bit more about the people involved. I got very specific advice from people like Brzezinski and Saul Linowitz on how to handle the Carter Center, how to manage the relationship with Carter. I was fortunate that I was able to interview maybe some 80 people, and that's not an exaggeration. Over a period of about 10 years, I interviewed 80 people: Palestinians, Israelis, Jordanians, Russians, Americans, a wide range of individuals, all who were associated one way or another with the diplomatic process. Those interviews were taped, and those interviews are available. At least 25 of the 80 are available on our website, israeled.org. And again, if you want to get drunk on data and on detail from some very smart people whose analyses were first rate. I mean, you listen to someone like an ambassador like Epi Evron, who was ambassador to Israel during the peace treaty signing, or you listen to an interview from Taksim Bashir, who was as close as anyone could have been to President Sadat. What you get is not only their view of the diplomacy of the moment, but you get their view of Jimmy Carter. You get their understanding of how they saw Carter, how they saw Brzezinski, how they saw Vance, how they saw the unfolding diplomacy. And then your goal is to somehow paste it all together. You're not writing a narrative, but you're writing a history where you try and make the connections work, and you try and discard people who are making political statements as compared to those who are just recollecting what happened. And some of these people's recollection are amazingly superb. Herman Iles, who was ambassador to Egypt, Roy Atherton, who served as ambassador for Arab-Israeli negotiations in 77, 78, and 79. Their views of the diplomatic process, and then you get sort of a consensus, and out of that consensus, you write a book, and that was the book that became Heroic Diplomacy. Kissinger, Carter, Sadat, and Begin, and it's the story of the peace process in the 70s. So in my history of being a historian, I came to the realization that there are many points of view, and you have to find some sort of overlap, and then you have to throw away the chaff and keep the wheat. I learned that the memoirs that were written during the Carter administration, or written by those who served in the Carter administration, Legacies, Brzezinski, and Vance, and Quant's book on Camp David, they all have very much an American egocentric attitude, which places the responsibility for success on Carter's shoulders. And he was a steward of this, there's no question about it. What you then find afterwards, once you start listening to the interviews, and then you find that the Israelis released documents in 2015, 2014 on the memorandum of the conversations that took place at Camp David, then you get a very different look at what went on, because the memorandum of materials that are available from the Camp David period are only synopses of the meetings. The Israeli, the Hebrew, they are complete renditions. Now, of course, it's the Israeli. I don't have the Egyptian renditions for what went on at Camp David. So there's a little bit more amplification that's required then to learn about what was Carter's attitude, how did he go through the negotiations, what role did Brzezinski play, and Vance, etc. Back to Jimmy Carter. Carter, when he was elected, had very little national experience. He had been the governor of Georgia. He'd been a state representative. He'd grown up in rural Georgia as a farmer. He was deeply interested in and passionate about helping people and individuals. I think his rural background and commitment to biblical learning made him and shaped his outlook of the world of problems can be resolved, and they can be resolved by give and take, in Hebrew, masah matan, but actually give and take, not you give and I take. And Carter believed that problems had logical conclusions. I think part of his innate personality was to make a difference and find solutions to problems. Highly industrious, very smart, very conscientious. Carter didn't believe problems couldn't be resolved. And that's why he threw himself in full scale into trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think he really believed he could find a comprehensive peace. I think he thought he could bring everyone together in a major Cecil B. DeMille conference, September, October of 1977. All he felt was that the individual leaders needed to make the necessary compromises, and he thought they should make the necessary compromises because he believed they should make them. And this was another unique part of Jimmy Carter's personality and his decision-making. And Stu Eisenstadt speaks about it in his biography of Carter, as does Peter Bourne in his biography of Carter, that Carter took a view of issues that if he thought that an issue could be resolved and it required resolution, and he thought it was the right thing to do, that even if there were obstacles in the way, he thought an effort should be made to try and overcome those obstacles. Some people have called it self-assurance. Some people have called it haughtiness. Some people have called it arrogance. But Carter believed if he could tackle a problem, he could resolve it. He had an engineering mentality. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's how he approached Arab-Israeli negotiations. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. But what he didn't want to do is when he became president, he did not want to follow in Kissinger's footsteps of going through some sort of slow, step-by-step process of a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit here and a little bit there. He wanted to go broad. He wanted to go wide. And as it turned out, even though he wanted a comprehensive peace, and Kissinger had negotiated Sinai 1 and Sinai 2 with the Egyptians and the Israelis, one in January of 1974 and another one in September of 1975. Carter did not want Sinai 3, and that's actually what he got. Carter was able to achieve Sinai 3, which was another disengagement agreement between Egypt and Israel. That, in fact, is what the Egyptian-Israeli treaty is. It's a disengagement agreement, but the culmination of it is the signing of the treaty on the 26th of March, 1979. Now, Carter, when he took office, he wasn't schooled necessarily in international politics or political cultures. He had met Brzezinski in 1975. Brzezinski then became his professor, and Brzezinski tutored him. And Carter gave a speech in Japan in May of 1975, and Brzezinski was impressed, and the folks who were shaping the Trilateral Commission were impressed. And Carter now rests a lot of his learning on Brzezinski, the Columbia professor, who saw the world pretty much as you can't trust the Soviet Union. But Carter didn't necessarily have a formula for reaching an Arab-Israeli negotiation until he met Brzezinski and until the Brookings paper came about in 1975, and that Brookings report is available. And as most of us know who follow the Middle East, it essentially said there should be an exchange of land for peace, the Palestinians should play a role, and withdrawal should go to about the 67 borders. That's was it in a nutshell. It was a lot more detailed, but that's it in a nutshell. And Brzezinski believed that a negotiated settlement was possible. And Brzezinski also had a view that you couldn't trust the Soviet Union. But Brzezinski's view was you had to embrace the Saudis in order to make the negotiations work. Because Brzezinski felt, and he convinced Carter of it, and I think Carter probably understood it without Brzezinski, that if the Saudis were going to increase the price of oil at any time during Carter's days in office, it was going to hurt the American economy. It was going to hurt Carter's chances of re-election. And so Brzezinski took the view that if you could make the Saudis reasonably satisfied that there was a Palestinian component to the resolution of the conflict, then the Saudis would not impose upon the United States undue pressure for the increase in the price of oil. And Brzezinski wrote about that in several articles in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy in 1975 and 1976. And those are all available. And Brzezinski writes about it in his memoir too. So it's not something like this is being invented out of a new piece of cloth. So Brzezinski's emphasis on the Saudis was terribly relevant. It was relevant because he believed that the only way that you could tame the Israelis would be to put pressure on them. And Brzezinski went so far as not only wanting to tame the Israelis, he wanted to tame the Israeli lobby in Washington. He actually says one of the reasons that I put together this plane deal in February of 1978, where the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Saudis would receive advanced equipment, fighter equipment. He said, I did it in order to limit AIPAC's influence. And you have interviews from other people like Mark Siegel, who served in getting Carter elected and then served in the White House and worked for Hamilton Jordan, and he was a liaison with the Jewish community. Siegel eventually resigns in March of 1978 over the plane deal. That's really a side story. The key to all this is that when Brzezinski and Carter focused on the Saudis, they were pushing their attention away from Sadat. Now, I have learned that it was Sadat who was the engine for most of the negotiations that took place after the October 1973 war. He and Golda conspired to have a Geneva conference in December of 1973. Well, I mean conspired, I don't necessarily mean it in a nefarious way, but they wanted to have a conference where the agreement was already worked out, was fashioned before they even got to the conference. So when you have a disengagement agreement coming, weeks after the December 1973 Geneva conference is coming in January of 1974, it's quite evidence that it was all pre-cooked. And that pre-cooking had actually taken place between two generals in the desert at Kilometer 1 in October, November of 1973, General Yariv and General Gamasi. How do I know that? Because I've interviewed them both. And they both told me exactly the same thing, that what we did, Kissinger pulled the rug out from our discussions so he could take it to negotiations and he could use it as the first outline for what the negotiations would be. And I asked Hal Saunders at one point in my rigorous pieces of research, I said, Hal, how did you have the maps in your particular file in your briefcase when you went to Aswan to negotiate this with Sadat? He said the maps were already there. I said, Hal, where did you get the maps? He said, I don't know. I showed him. I said, is this one of your maps? He looked at it. He said, how did you get it? I said, Yariv gave it to me. He said, you mean it was Yariv and Gamasi who came up with the maps that we used in January of 74? I said, apparently, yes. Now, the interesting part about history is you never know where an idea begins and you never know who says it in a meeting. Two people are having a meeting of four eyes, two people are meeting together. Someone makes a suggestion. Someone comes out of that meeting and says, I made the suggestion that X should occur. And what it was Y who made the suggestion, but X took the credit for it. Well, you never know that unless you get the minutes of those particular meetings. And what I began to realize is I needed to be skeptical of sources. I needed to be sure I knew exactly what happened and who was responsible for what. I didn't know who was responsible for having Sinai, U.S. Troops in Sinai as part of Sinai 2. That was a critical part of the second Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreement, is that the Egyptians suggested to Rabin, and Rabin concurred to Sadat privately, that if the Americans played a role in the Mitla passes as observers, then Egypt and Israel would come to agreement because they'd be quite certain that no one was going to violate an agreement in which the Americans were essentially a guarantor. Even those people in Sinai weren't officially U.S. military, they were private citizens. Well, what Brzezinski did, Brzezinski moved the focal point away from Sadat, and Sadat didn't like it. Sadat wanted the luminescence to be on his shoulders. He wanted to be the one who would lead Egypt out of its economic dereliction, out of its bad condition, away from the Soviet Union, attach himself to the United States and its technology and its military equipment. Carter tried all during 1977 to have a comprehensive peace. Didn't work. And it didn't work because Assad wasn't going to negotiate with the Israelis, and Hussein wasn't negotiate with the Israelis, and the PLO and Arafat certainly weren't negotiate with the Israelis, let alone the Israelis wanting to give up the West Bank or Jerusalem as the potential geographic locus for Palestinian state or Palestinian self-determination. So what Carter ultimately was able to accomplish after Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, and Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 77 was essentially a statement that said, me, Egypt, we're the one who's going to push this. I want Sinai back. Sinai is absolutely, now I'm going to skip ahead all through 1979 into 1980, and suffice it to say that Carter realized in July or August of 78 1978, before Camp David, he realized that maybe the best thing he could get would be out of a bilateral agreement, a bilateral Egyptian-Israeli agreement. So I went back and I looked at an interview which I did with Carter myself in February of 1991. And in that interview, Carter said to me, I told Sadat that a peace treaty between you and Israel was not good enough in the next generation. Sadat's response to Carter was, you know, Mr. President, if necessary, I'll sign a peace treaty with him. It means if Carter had that in his pocket in April of 1977, that means he went through all of the next year knowing he had it in his hip pocket. And what Carter tried to do, he tried to expand what he knew he had into something that was more comprehensive and broader, and that's what Brzezinski wanted. When they walked away from Camp David, they walked away with Sinai 3. Carter leaves the White House terribly disappointed that he was unable to accomplish what he really wanted, was a comprehensive peace. And when he becomes an ex-president, he proceeds to engage in what essentially becomes the first major example of track 2 diplomacy. The idea only evolved in 1981. Our Carter Center consultation on the Middle East, which I directed and I managed, was essentially an effort to bring together people from all viewpoints from the Middle East, as many academics and scholars as I could get my hands on. Carter calls me a week before the consultation in November of 1983, and it's the first major event of the Carter Center. And he turned and he said to me on the telephone, he said, do you really think this is going to work? I said, Mr. President, if you and Gerald Ford don't show up, I promise you it will work because I have the best scholars and the best former diplomats in the world. They will make it work. You two just have to sit there and absorb some really incredible information. And that's what happened. And the 1983 consultation far exceeded his expectations, way far exceeded his expectations. And he even says it to a gentleman who writes a book called The Unfinished Presidency. His name he's Professor Brinkley from Rice University. He said, if it hadn't been for Zabig and Saul and Ken, Rosalind and I would not have walked away from this meeting feeling that we were really energized by what was to come. So what the Carter Center essentially did was Carter's podium for speaking out on a whole variety of issues, not just the Middle East. He tackled democracy in Latin America. He tackled monitoring elections. By 1986, he moved the Carter Center away from just having meetings to being actively involved and engaged abroad. And he did that through healthcare. And the guy who succeeded me as executive director, Bill Foege, Foege, he deserves an enormous amount of credit for moving the Carter Center away from just social science discovery, which was wonderful because we were bringing people together and having them talk, and otherwise these people couldn't chat together. I know in our third Middle East meeting in 1990, believe it or not, the director general of the Syrian Foreign Ministry showed up. His name is Walid Muallim. And Walid Muallim has a conversation with a guy by the name of Itamar Rabinovich, who was a professor and then president at Tel Aviv University. And Itamar later on becoming Rabin's leading negotiator on Syria. And his relationship with Walid Muallim began at the Carter Center in March of 1990. Now, we don't deserve the credit for what happened or didn't happen between Muallim and Rabinovich, but this was truly track 2 diplomacy. And Carter thrived in people coming to see him. He was a magnet. People were attracted to him. People understood that the Middle East consultation, people came and they talked frankly, and it was open, and there was very little rancor. We did a consultation on the Middle East in 87. We did one in 90. We did one on Latin America. We did one on the Soviet Union. We did one on healthcare. Carter understood that even though he lost the presidency, his presidential center was his podium for speaking out. And Carter, like no other former president, spoke out more frequently and more often on more topics, foreign policy topics mostly, than any other former president. Carter wrote 30 books, and almost 60% of them were on the Middle East. I mean, the man was hooked on the conflict. He was hooked on resolving the conflict. I can't tell you how many times, maybe a dozen times, he said to me while sitting in the back of the limousine or sitting over lunch or some private discussion, he said, if they only give me a chance, if Reagan only gives me a chance, if Bush only gives me a chance, if Clinton only gives me a chance, I could get back into this and I could finish what I didn't finish in 1979, 1980. And I sitting there like a good historian, always making comparisons. I said, Mr. President, Arafat is not Sadat, and Sinai is not the West Bank. Geographic differences, leaders were totally different. Begin and Sadat were willing to take risks. They were heroes. They looked over the horizon. They saw what was good for their country. They were willing to exchange carrots and sticks, and they both recognized each other's legitimacy and sovereignty. And all I've been hearing for the last 35 years is a two-state solution, a two-state solution. That's a great idea. It's a great idea. But if the two sides to the conflict, the Palestinians and the Israelis, don't recognize the sovereignty or the legitimacy of the other, you don't have any trust in order to negotiate anything. Carter, when he got to the mid-90s, was already speaking out with a greater degree of harshness against Israel than he had previously. And I had already in the early 80s and in the mid 80s written them private memorandums saying, Mr. President, if you want to get back into this, you cannot get back into this as a mediator if you're going to be one-sided. You have to be, even if you feel privately that way, you can't talk about it. And I counted at least 8 or 9 memos, which I wrote from early 83 into the early 90s, in which I said that to him. And then I finally put up my hand and I said, Mr. President, I need to go back to full-time teaching. And he wanted to go away from having all these scholarly academics. He wanted to be able to go out on his own and more frequently and more overtly and speak out and get engaged and do more humanitarian things, eradication of river blindness and earth and he wanted to embrace those communities in the world that didn't have a voice. He felt he should represent the disenfranchised. And here, for that, I go back to his biblical background, and I think he really believed he had the same need in life that he felt Jesus had. And I don't mean that in any joking way. I think he believed he had a mission, and his mission was to resolve problems and to make life better for people. And that's what the Carter Center ended up doing. Did anyone at the Carter Center who helped fashion its origins in 1981 or 82 or 83, did any of us have a notion that that's what the Carter Center would be in 45 years? I don't remember the president of the university, Jim Laney, speaking about it. I don't remember the 5 or 6 professors who sat on the committee that where Carter said, I want our center to be action-oriented. No one talked about healing the world or eradicating disease or monitoring elections. It all had to do with the issues that were at hand: Latin America, Soviet Union, Middle East, maybe a little bit of healthcare, but not a lot. And the Carter Center then morphed into something that was tiny in 1981. When I was appointed the first permanent executive director of the Carter Center in 1982, I had a diligent secretary, Diane Rieger, and I had 4 student interns who worked amazingly to pull off this consultation with international leaders. We had 5 people, 6 people maybe. They have 3,500 people around the world now. They have an endowment that may be $750 to $1 billion. We were barely glad to get $150,000 from the from the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation and one or two others just to pull off our first meeting in 1983. It's become huge, and it's become really important internationally, and it's got a reputation which no one can take away. That didn't keep Carter from harping on an innate desire to resolve the conflict, and that meant pushing the Israelis, arguing with Israeli leaders, saying that they weren't doing enough. And finally, Carter gets the Nobel Prize in 2002. And after the Nobel Prize, he even becomes more virulent in his request or his efforts to find a resolution to the conflict. In 2003, he does something which no one paid too much attention to. He started embracing Hamas. He started bringing Hamas closer to his view. He felt that if Hamas participated in negotiations, they would alter their attitude to destroy Israel and kill Jews, and they would be their engagement in the negotiating process would modify their ideology. And this is a core point, and I'm going to stop at this. We grow up in the West understanding that conflicts can be mediated, they can be adjudicated, they can be resolved if there's give and take, if there is a willingness on each side to give to the other. We do not grow up with an understanding that there may be an ideology, there may be an outlook that doesn't like you just because of who you are, just because of your religion, or just because of the color of your skin. Israel made a tragic mistake on October 7th. They didn't believe what Hamas had been telling them for decades. We want to eradicate you. We want to wipe you off the face of the earth. Carter did not allow ideology or history or precedent to get in the way unduly of what he wanted to accomplish. He thought people had to discard those constraints and not be hampered by them. And then they could resolve the problem. And then all things would be good. Last point. Carter grew up in rural Georgia. When we went to visit Sadat's village in 1983 in Mintokum, and we went to see Assad's village in Kadaha, outside of Latakia, in 1987, he was careful to tell everyone there, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Carter. I'm a peanut farmer." He brought with him his formative experience of growing up in the South, of growing up in rural Georgia. And he identified with people who worked with their hands and got things done. He did not grow up in an environment of Washington politics, of going through Washington, of being experienced in international affairs. You know, the comparison between Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden, and I'm not talking about whether they were good or bad presidents. Biden had something like 36 years of experience before he became president. Carter had none from Washington. He had no real knowledge of political cultures. He didn't know how difficult it would be to negotiate with an Assad and an Arafat and a Sadat and a Begin and a King Hussein and the Saudi family. As I said to an interviewer a couple of days ago, it's like me playing against LeBron James 7 times. Carter took on one of the most difficult issues at the moment in international affairs, and he assumed that these leaders would follow because he thought the outline that he and Brzezinski had was a good outline, and that compromise would ultimately result. We have to realize, as we send people to Washington, we have to realize what they don't know about foreign political cultures or what they don't know about how Washington works and operates. Hamilton Jordan has wonderful interviews in the Miller Center University of Virginia Miller Center, 1981, on what we did right and what we did wrong in the Carter presidency. And Hamilton is amazingly honest. And he said, our biggest problem is we ran against Washington because we were outsiders. Then we thought we could govern Washington as outsiders. There's a lot to be learned in this lesson as a historian. What are the formative experiences of individuals that shape their future? Sadat, Assad, Begin, Arafat, all of them have had early learning and early experiences that shape them later in life. Asaf, sorry for going on so long. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. This is a phenomenal lesson in history, and nobody else has that historical understanding and the intimate interaction that you did, which is phenomenal, and we appreciate all of that. So thank you for all of that. Before we turn it on to the audience, and I know there's a lot of questions, let me take the prerogative of asking the first question, and I know Alex also has a question, and then we'll take it from there. Um, it- you know, just going back to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, and obviously you were, explaining Carter's religiosity, his belief that he could make it happen because he was Carter versus, some of the facts. One of the cornerstone issues, that you talk about in the article that you wrote is really his interpretation of 242. And really which has become obviously the cornerstone for land for peace concept, and obviously this is what he manipulates in his book in '06. Can you go into that a bit? I mean, this is also part of the what you also mentioned in the article as it relates to his conversations regarding the settlement freeze during the autonomous conversations, and then how it all played out. But really, where his adaptation of the mandated freeze, which is where in the Arabic version they describe, only the land versus land for peace and all of that. But a little bit more comments about that, I think, would be very useful as to, everything else you describe.
Yeah, I don't think it's really complex. Um, Carter, he didn't like precedent. The fact that it took 6 months to get Resolution 242 negotiated in 1967 didn't matter. It didn't comport with what he thought was necessary. If the Israelis weren't mandated to withdraw from the territories, which he said, by the way, Begin promised at Camp David, he happens to say that in Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. If the Israelis are not going to withdraw from these territories, then the fulfillment of his political goal of Palestinian self-determination and a Palestinian state cannot evolve. I mean, it's quite simple. If A doesn't occur, B can't happen. And I commented in an article which I wrote in Middle East Quarterly about that in 2007. I said you can't change a reality, and you can't change geography. And the geography of the West Bank is not the geography of Sinai. And even if there's a formula that says you should or you could, how many hours were spent at Camp David with Vance and Brzezinski trying to persuade Dayan and Barak and Begin to include even the mention of Resolution 242 in the Camp David Accords? Finally, the Israelis relented, but they weren't going to give it an interpretation. I think that's the best way to answer it, is a simple way of answering it. It didn't comport with what Carter wanted, and therefore it had to be redesigned according to his needs.
All right, thank you. Alex, on to you.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, first of all. This is, I mean, it's tremendous, and there's so much to talk about. It takes me back many years to the Carter administration. And, one of my encounters with these kinds of political realities, I think my question is really very simple. You've described a man who refused to understand anyone else's ideology, refused to accept that other people had ideological interests. And we can broaden this your discussion, I think, to another critical area, and that's the Iran hostage crisis, and the period that led up to the hostage crisis, where uh, the Shah was falling and falling and falling, and the U.S. administration was in various kinds of contact with Khomeini and didn't understand, just didn't understand what it was or who it was that they were dealing with. So my question really is, what's the source? It's two parts. What's the source of Carter's unwillingness to accept other people's ideology, and what was his ideology? And was he, in fact, a kind of supersessionist who saw...
That's an area that I'm not going to get into because I don't know anything. I mean, that last part, supersessionism, is way beyond my ken. So you forgive me. Let me just stay with the Middle East. That's difficult enough as it is. I don't mean to cut you off, Alex. You want to finish?
No, that's fine.
I don't think Jimmy Carter believed that others didn't have an ideology. I mean, he understood biblical ideology. He understood the Bible. I mean, if a Christian who believes in the Bible doesn't have an ideology, then who has an ideology? He believed that other people had ideologies. He just thought that they could be compromised and they could be worked around, and you get around a speed bump, or you get around a pothole. But he didn't realize how fervently committed Assad was to this notion of Greater Syria, or how committed the Begin and the Likud party were to retention of the West Bank. He could not grasp that. He just couldn't. Maybe he wouldn't. And as far as Iran is concerned, I think the Carter administration spent a terrific amount of time on trying to resolve a really important issue, the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. And I think some of the State Department officials would tell you, who worked the problem, that they spent too much time on Arab-Israeli and insufficient time in understanding what was unfolding in 77 and 78 in Iran. Second, I think it would be very difficult for me, growing up on Long Island, the son of German Jewish immigrants, to understand the difference between Sunni and Shia Islam. I don't think Carter grew up with it in South Georgia either. I think he had to learn a lot. He had to depend on people's opinions. I mean, you talk to some of the professors who were at the University of Chicago in 77 and 78. One of them came and talked in Atlanta, and he said to me, it's amazing that no one at the CIA and no one at the NSC really has an idea of what goes on in Qum and what goes on amongst the clerics. And then you go read some of the quotations by some of the leading professors on Iran, Richard Cottam, who was at Pittsburgh, or Richard Falk, who was at Princeton, or others who embraced Khomeini as, don't worry, he's going to be okay. He's a liberal. He's going to embrace democracy. I mean, Andy Young called him a saint. Now, I'm not faulting these professors. When I'm faulting them for what they said, I'm faulting them because I believe they said it because they didn't like the Shah. And they said it because they wanted to see the Shah go. Now, whether they converted their interpretations of Shia Islam as Ayatollah Khomeini was evolving it privately and quietly while he was resident in Paris, I'm not certain about that. All I know is what they said in public. And if Carter was listening to these academics who ostensibly knew what was going on in Iran, and in late 78 and early 79, they were saying, you know, it's not going to be so bad, it'll be okay. And what happens by 81 and 82 is Gotzbade, and all of those so-called moderates are being tossed out and ultimately being killed. Who understood what radical Islam was? Who in the American academic Middle Eastern audience understood? Were we trained this? I wasn't trained about this at the University of Michigan. I don't think people at Harvard or Columbia were trained about this. What did we know about it? We knew about traditional Islam attitudes toward minorities, or we knew about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. We knew about you could make peace with make a temporary treaty with the enemy and then go back and kill the enemy later. We learned all that in Islamic history. I don't think anyone coming out of American academic institutions, maybe with few exceptions, came away with this notion of this could be really toxic and this could really be bad and this could really be turned against us. And boy, don't forget that they have going to have a lot of petrodollars to spend on broadcasting their toxic ideology. I don't know. I mean, Brzezinski actually said this is not a crisis for us. What did he know? I mean, no offense to Brzezinski. He was a great scholar. He was a great professor at Columbia. But I'm not a scholar of Renaissance art, and don't ask me to teach it, and don't ask me to analyze it, because I haven't got a clue. I'm still not sure I have a clue about Middle Eastern politics, and I've been studying it for 50 years. Politicians have to rely upon others for advice, and then they have to make decisions. And Brzezinski had one view of how to resolve Iran. He wanted to use force, and others did not like realpolitik. They thought it was much more important to negotiate with whoever the new bunch was who were coming into office. And there was this tension between the White House and the State Department on what decisions to make. And Brzezinski, I think, actually says it in his memoir. Carter wasn't quite sure what decision to make about Iran. Now, what does Donald Trump know about Iran? What did Barack Obama know about Iran? They only knew what they learned after they came to office and they read memos. Granted, that's how you have to learn about things you know nothing about. But if I had been Barack Obama, I would have not stood up at the UN in September of 2013 and said, we want to have an agreement with you, we want to have an understanding with you, and don't worry about it. We're not interested in regime change. Oh, really? You're not interested in regime change? I can bet there were a lot of Ayatollahs who went to their liquor cabinet and had a big schnapps that night. Why do you have to say in public what you're not going to do? Why do you have to say you're not going to use force to resolve a problem, even if you don't want to? Who shows the 5 cards in your poker game? Who shows 4 of your 5 cards before you even get to bidding? You know, sometimes it's better to say nothing. When in doubt, leave it out. The key question, Alex, is could Iran have turned out differently? And that's a what if. If the United States had recognized earlier that the Shah was not treating his people properly, that he had a terrible reputation at home, if we had realized that, maybe Carter would not have stood up at a toast for the Shah in January of 78 in Tehran and toasted him as being a great man and a great leader of his people. Do you know how those people who felt like Sadat had taken away their loved ones and had just thrown them in jail and killed them, had they felt about an American president toasting their Shah for being loved by his people? Did Carter understand the dynamics of what was going on internally in Iran then? Now, maybe Carter had a bad habit of just praising bad people. Maybe that was it. Or maybe he never wanted to say anything negative with someone who was being your host. I don't know. I don't know that for certain. But we know now afterwards that that toast really irritated much of the opposition inside Iran. And it wasn't just the radical Islamicists that were irritated. It was the liberal Democrats, or call them liberal Democrats, if you will. Middle East will come bite every president. No question about it. Every president is going to get bitten by some aspect of the Middle East. And every president since Carter has been. And it's going to happen again. And I suspect the best thing for us to do is to have people make decisions who understand context and perspective and understand what didn't work previously and don't make the same mistake again.
Great. Thank you for that. There's a lot to be learned from that. I'm going to go to the audience. I just want to try to take a few questions. I know we're limited with time, so I don't want to abuse your time, Ken, but let me try to combine a few questions here and try to
I'm
take
in
it.
retirement. I'm in retirement. You can abuse me all you want, also.
I try not to be respectful, but thank you. So David Narrett is asking a question. What is your thoughts on what came out as Dershowitz's statement that Carter advised Arafat to reject the peace process in Camp David in 2000, and what was the cost of Carter reaching out to Hania and Assad in 2009? Any thoughts on that?
I have no knowledge of his personal communications with Arafat either in 2000. I would have no knowledge of it. I find it hard to believe that people can live so far away from the source material and speculate so eloquently and completely. And I do know that his embrace of Hamas, I do know from the collection of information which I have found and we posted on our website, Jimmy Carter's Embrace of Hamas, is a collection of quotations from Hamas officials and from Carter that they felt gratified that Carter had given them a measure of legitimacy, and they say so. Hani, I believe, says it. I think Michelle says it. And I believe that you go back and you listen to what people say, or you read what they say, and then you sort of put them together, and then you create some sort of like an evidentiary mass, and those are your conclusions. But let's be fair to Carter. He wasn't the only one who wanted to embrace Hamas. There were others in the United States. Martin Indig thought it would be a great idea. May he rest in peace. He thought it was a great idea to embrace Hamas. And there were others who put their hand up and said, we have to find a way for the Palestinians, the PLO and the PA, to reconcile with Hamas. Because if we do, then we can get negotiations started with the Israelis. That was the assumption. So what mediators want to do is they want to find ways to glue the problems together so that you can move forward to resolving the next aspect of the problem. And as we know, as we've learned since Hamas was established in '98, that all those efforts trying to get the PA and the PLO to speak with Hamas or to engage with Hamas on an equal basis, we know that all those efforts at unity have fallen on hard rocks. There's a different view. There's one view within the Palestinian national movement that says we could probably live here alongside with the Israelis. And there's another view within the Palestinian Arab national movement that says we can't live with any Israeli or any Jew west of the Jordan River. And those are the realities. And no amount of papering over them will make them go away. I can't speculate on whether Arafat did or did not embrace Camp David 2000. If I had been Arafat, I wouldn't have embraced it, because why would he want to give up the liberation of Palestine when he'd lived that life for his entire career? Was he really believing that he could recognize the state of Israel and give up the right of return? I mean, let's be serious about who influenced whom. What were the bottom line questions that were being asked in 2000? I mean, Clinton tried very hard. He tried very hard, diligently, with really smart people as his advisors. But you can't get someone to move away from their fossilized view if the fossilized view is all they have. If I had time, I'd tell you a story about my own meeting with Arafat in '93, but that's for another time. But the point is, Arafat understood full well what he represented for the Palestinian national movement. And he understood that '93 and accepting Oslo was his way of retaining his position as the leadership of the PLO. And he alienated so many members of the PLO executive committee by recognizing Israel. But he did it because he needed to preserve his own autocracy within the movement. He was a very successful politician. Whether he represented his people appropriately or properly is not for me to decide.
Great, thank you. Let me try to combine two more questions here, given our limited time. But some questions, by James Mueller and Robert Olish was asking about really more your views on Carter's feeling about the Jewish people and anti-Semitism, and really how did that fit into his biblical upbringing, and how did he understand the Bible and the New Testament and their view of Jews in general as a result of his biblical upbringing?
I don't know. I'm not being coy here. And I'm not saying it because we haven't yet had his funeral. And, my sense was that in the White House, he surrounded himself with some really terrific advisors, some of whom were Jewish. He did the same thing at the Carter Center. Many of us who were fellows were Jewish, some practicing, some not, but we were ethnically identified as certainly being Jewish. Did he take care to observe the holidays and the outlooks that some of us had as Jews? The answer is yes. Did he have a biblical background which suggested that the fact that the Jews didn't embrace Christ was their shortcoming? Perhaps. But where does he take that? Does he take that to being an overt anti-Semite? You have to show that to me. Did he call for Israelis to be killed until they accepted a roadmap for peace, as he did in Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid? That's what he said in the first draft of the book, and one of the major reasons why I resigned. He was saying that terrorism is okay until Israelis do X. Well, I wasn't something I could stomach, and 12 members of the Carter Presidential Center, Carter Library, they said, Ken, your argument is right. We'll follow. When he went around the country and he said, I wrote every word of the book and I'm taking full responsibility for it, I think he compounded it. But then when they wrote a second edition and never called it a second edition, they took out that sentence from the book. And let me leave you with this note. We were returning on our trip from the Middle East in 1983 on a private, I think it was a 727. At about 25,000 feet, we had just left Beirut and we were on the way to Morocco, and it was a Friday evening. And it was getting to be dusk. And it's President Carter, Mrs. Carter, his diligent administrative assistant, Faye Dill, and me. And the wine steward brings 4 glasses of wine. And then he turns to the wine steward and he said, would you bring the candles and bring the challah? I looked at him and I said, where'd you get the challah? He said, when we were in Jerusalem 3 days ago, I got the challah. I asked the steward to go buy one because I knew we would be here on Friday night going to Morocco. And then he said to me, he said, Ken, would you say the Friday night blessing? and light the candles. And I did. As I've done my entire life. Now, that was a telling moment for me. Did he disregard my Jewishness? No. Did he dislike Israeli policies? Absolutely, particularly as it had an impact upon the Palestinians and withdrawal, and he thought Begin lied to him. But I think Carter had a sense of respect for other religions, including mine. And I never felt, and I don't think any other person at the Carter Center who was Jewish ever felt any tinge of something that was not exactly the way it should be in terms of behavior and attitudes. It's easy to put a label on someone when you're afar and you think it smells like it, it must be it. I can't state what someone wants me to state, simply because it would be convenient, and then someone would quote it later on and say, you know, Stein in that interview with SPME said blank, blank, and blank. That's not what I do as a historian. That's not what I do.
Well, we would never do that to you, Ken. And we are grateful for you taking the time to talk to us. It really means a lot to us, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join Alex and me, and of course the audience for joining us this afternoon. It means a lot. This is an important story and really an important part of history that, you know, as all of us historians, you know, appreciate. We need to look to we need to look at these historical patterns to try to understand the future. And maybe we'll understand something, the sliver that, you know, even after 50 years, to your point, we still don't get. So maybe there's hope.
It's always important to understand what you don't get. And the other part is American exceptionalism is not always the right answer.
Yep. Well, you know, hopefully we can learn from our mistakes. Maybe.
Alex, Asaf, thank you. Thank you to your staff. And thank you to those who are members of SPME and ASMEA. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully when the book comes out, you'll come out and we'll talk about the book again, and there'll be more to talk about. But I really want to thank Alex, Ken, for joining me this afternoon. For all the audience who came to join us this afternoon, I apologize we didn't get to all the questions, but we will do our best to respond afterwards. So I wish everybody a good day, stay safe, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.